She was standing at my front door, the door I had repainted myself 2 summers ago because she said the old color made the house look tired, and she told me, with her coat still on and her keys still in her hand, that I needed to start living within my means. I had just handed her a check. I remember standing there with the kettle starting to whistle behind me, and I thought, did I hear that right? Did she just, in my kitchen, in my house, with my tea going, tell me to live within my means? I had been paying 97 separate bills for my son and his wife for 4 years. 97. I know, because I counted them that same night, sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a cup of chamomile that went cold before I'd gotten through half the list. I want to tell you how I got there, because it didn't happen all at once. It never does. My name doesn't matter much for this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old, I live in Sudbury, Ontario. I worked for 31 years as a school board administrator, and I am, or I was, the kind of woman who says yes when she should say no. Not because I'm weak. I want to be clear about that. I said yes because I loved my son, because I remembered holding him in the parking lot of the Laurentian Hospital in January 1987 in -22 weather, and thinking I would walk through fire for this child. That feeling doesn't just disappear because he's grown. It doesn't come with an expiry date. Nobody tells you that. Nobody warns you. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is. And in this story, that's all that matters. Married his wife 6 years ago. She's from southern Ontario, from a family with what I'd describe as expensive taste and modest income, which is a combination I've come to recognize as dangerous. The wedding was lovely. I paid for a portion of it. I didn't mind. That's what parents do. The first time he called asking for help, it was for a car payment. He'd gotten a new position in Barrie, good salary, benefits, the works. But the timing was off, he said. Just 1 month, he said. He sounded embarrassed about it, and I found that embarrassing enough that I transferred the money before we even hung up. I didn't want him to feel ashamed. I'm his mother. That's not what mothers are for. The second time was rent. Then it was his wife's student loan. She'd done a program in event planning, and the certification cost more than she'd anticipated. Then it was a vet bill for their dog. Then it was a weekend trip they'd already booked and couldn't afford to cancel, so could I cover the hydro while they were away? Then it was Christmas. Then it was her birthday dinner, which was at a restaurant in Yorkville I'd never been to, and when I saw the total, I had to put it on my line of credit. I don't know exactly when I stopped counting the individual things and started just covering whatever came next. I think it was sometime in year 2. The requests stopped feeling like emergencies and started feeling like scheduling, like something that just happened on a regular basis, like a bill coming in, because that's what it had become. I had become their billing department. My pension from the school board is decent. Not lavish, but decent. I have my house, which is paid off. I have a small RRSP I'd been adding to since my late 30s. I'm not rich, but I'm comfortable, and comfortable had always felt like enough. It was enough for me. I'd raised my son alone after his father and I separated, and comfortable got us through just fine. But comfortable has a limit, and I had been chipping away at mine for 4 years without fully admitting it to myself. The thing about the money is that I kept thinking it was temporary. I kept waiting for the moment when they'd say, "Okay, we're good now. We've got our feet under us." I was waiting for them to stabilize, and they never did, or more accurately, they never needed to, because I was the stabilizer. I was the reason they never to face the bottom. I kept the floor from giving out. My daughter-in-law had quit her job in event planning about a year into the marriage. I understood at first. She'd had a difficult manager. The hours were brutal. She needed a break. But the break stretched to 3 months, then 6. Then she started talking about starting her own business and needing capital. And the next thing I knew, I was putting $2,000 into a business account that, as far as I could tell, was mostly used for branding consultations and a professional Instagram account. My son was working, I'll say that for him. Long hours, real effort, good salary by any reasonable measure. But they spent every dollar he made and then some. Nice apartment in a neighborhood I couldn't afford to live in, gym memberships, meal kits, a car lease on a model that was well above what they needed. Trips, not 1, not 2, Mexico in February, Portugal in May, Nashville for a long weekend because she had a friend getting married and they needed a hotel that was right in the thick of things. And I was paying their cell phone plan, their streaming subscriptions, their Costco membership, which I thought was practical, until I found out they were shopping there for items to resell at a markup through her Instagram page. I found that out by accident, the same way I found out most things, because I was in the background writing checks and nobody thought to keep me informed. The evening my daughter-in-law told me to live within my means, I had driven 2 hours down to Barrie because my son had texted asking if we could meet. Just the 2 of us, he'd said. I'd been looking forward to it. I brought a loaf of banana bread I'd made the day before because I remembered it was his favorite, and I stopped for gas and a coffee at the Barrie South Station, and I drove there thinking maybe we'd sit and talk the way we used to, just him and me. She answered the door. He wasn't home yet, she said. Come in, she said, but she said it the way you say it to a contractor you're not sure you need. I sat at their kitchen island on a stool that cost more than my first couch, and I drank tea from a mug that had her initials on it, and I waited. And while I waited, she told me that things were tight, that she and my son had been talking, that perhaps I should think about downsizing my house to free up some equity because they really couldn't keep relying on my help if I wasn't going to manage my resources better. Manage my resources better. I looked at the copper pendant light above the island. I looked at the open shelving with the matching ceramic containers. I looked at the weekend bag by the closet that still had an Air Canada tag on it from their trip to Portugal. I didn't say anything. She kept talking. She said something about how I should be thinking about my retirement more seriously. I'm 63, I wanted to say. I was thinking about my retirement more seriously than she'd ever thought about anything. I thought about it every time I transferred money to cover a car payment that wasn't mine. My son came home about 20 minutes later. He kissed her first, which is fine, that's normal. I don't hold that against him. Then he sat down across from me, and he looked tired and a little uncomfortable, and I realized he'd known she was going to say this. He'd let her say it because he didn't want to be the one to. I drove home that night with the banana bread still in the back seat because I'd forgotten to take it out of the car, and somewhere around Parry Sound, I started to really understand what had happened. I pulled into a Tim Hortons and sat in the parking lot with the engine running, and I thought about the list. All 97 items, not emergencies, not one-time things, a system, a structure, an arrangement that they had built around me without asking if I wanted to be a foundation. I went home. I made a different kind of list. I pulled out my bank statements, all 4 years of them, which took me most of the night because some of them I had to download from online banking, and others I had to dig out of a filing box in the spare room. I have a brother who's an accountant, and years ago he made me promise to keep everything. I was glad that night that I'd kept everything. By 2 in the morning I had a number. I won't tell you the exact amount. I will tell you it was more than I had spent on my son's entire childhood. Hockey registration, school trips, every winter coat, every pair of boots, 4 years of university at Laurentian, the whole thing. More than all of that. I sat with that number for a long time. I made another cup of tea. I looked out at the backyard, at the bird feeder I'd put up in October that was already going through a bag of sunflower seeds a week because the chickadees had found it, and I thought, I have been feeding the wrong things. The next week, I did not transfer any money. Nobody called to ask why. That told me something. The week after, I called my bank and I removed my son from the joint account we'd kept open since he was in university, the one I'd used to transfer funds. I did it on a Tuesday morning. The woman on the phone was very kind, very professional, no questions asked. Then I went through the list, all 97 items. Some were direct transfers I could simply stop. Some were pre-authorized payments I had to cancel separately. The cell phone plan required a call to the provider. I was the account holder, which I hadn't fully registered until that moment, which meant I'd been responsible for the contract this whole time. The streaming subscriptions were easy. The insurance I'd been splitting with them on the car lease, that one took 2 calls and a form. It took me 11 days to work through all 97 items. I kept a checklist. I crossed each one off with a red pen. There was something about the red that felt right. I did not call my son during those 11 days. I did not explain myself. I had spent 4 years explaining myself. Explaining why I was happy to help. Explaining that I didn't need to be paid back. Explaining that family helps family. I was done explaining. On the 12th day, my daughter-in-law called. She started with the cell phone. There'd been a disruption in service, she said. Had I noticed anything on my end? I told her I'd canceled the account. There was a pause. Then she asked about the car insurance. I told her I'd removed my name from that as well. Another pause, longer this time. Then she said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I'm living within my means." I would be lying if I told you there was a long silence after that. There wasn't. She had something to say about everything, as it turned out. She was sharp about it. She used words like blindsided and without warning, and not the time for this. She mentioned that they had commitments, that things were arranged around certain assumptions. I let her talk. And when she was done, I said, very calmly, because I'd had 11 days to prepare for this call, I said that she was right. Things had been arranged around certain assumptions, and I had been the assumption, and I wasn't available for that anymore. She hung up. My son called 2 hours later. He sounded different from his wife, quieter, less sharpened. He didn't argue. He said he didn't understand what had happened, and I told him I'd been paying for things on a list that had grown to 97 items without anyone asking whether I could afford it or whether I wanted to, and that when I'd visited in November, I'd been told to manage my resources better, and that's exactly what I was doing. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, 97 things? I said yes. He asked if I could send him the list. I said I wasn't doing that. I said I thought he probably had a better sense of it than he was letting on. That was hard to say. It was the hardest thing in the conversation, because I do believe he knew. Not every detail, maybe, but he knew enough. He had been letting it happen because it was easier than stopping it, and I understood that, because I had done the same thing myself. We didn't end the call warmly, but we ended it honestly, which I think is its own kind of warmth. The months that followed were strange. I won't pretend otherwise. There were weeks of silence that felt like a held breath. My daughter-in-law's mother called me once. An awkward, aggressive phone call that I ended after 4 minutes by saying I wasn't going to discuss my finances with someone I'd met 3 times. She did not call again. I found out, in a roundabout way through someone who knew them from the building, that they'd had to move out of the Barry apartment. The lease on the car was returned. I'm not going to say I was glad about any of that. These were hard things for real people, and one of those people was my son. But I'm also not going to say I felt nothing. I felt something. I felt the particular sensation of watching a person realize that a floor they've been walking on is not solid ground. That's a hard thing to feel, and it's also a necessary one. He called me in February, not to argue. He asked if he could come up to Sudbury and talk. I said yes. He arrived on a Saturday morning in his own car, a used Civic he'd apparently bought after returning the lease, which was the most sensible choice he'd made in years. He brought coffee from the drive-thru on Paris Street, the good one, the one I like. He knew which one. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd made my lists, and he talked. Not about the money, not at first. He talked about the apartment and the move, and about some things in the marriage that had been harder than he'd shown. He talked about pressure, about how it had felt easier to call me than to have certain conversations with his wife, about how he hadn't let himself think about what it was costing me, because thinking about it would have meant having to do something about it. I listened to all of it. And then I said, I know. I think I didn't let myself think about it either. We both sat with that for a while. He asked if I was okay. Financially, he meant. I told him I was, that I'd made some adjustments, that my line of credit was higher than I wanted it to be but manageable, and that I'd already started putting money back into the RRSP I'd been quietly neglecting. He looked at the table when I said that. He looked at it for a long time. I told him I didn't want an apology for the money. I meant that genuinely. What's gone is gone, and I'm not interested in accounting for it. What I told him I wanted was for him to know me as someone with limits, not as a bottomless resource, not as a backup fund, as his mother, a specific person, with a specific life, with things she's worked for and things she still wants to do. I told him I want to go to Newfoundland. I've wanted to go to Newfoundland for 15 years. Cape St. Mary's, the Bonavista Peninsula, all of it. I've had a folder on my computer with saved articles and ferry schedules and B&B listings since 2009, and I have never gone because there was always something else the money needed to do. He looked up from the table. He said, I didn't know that. I said, no, you didn't. There are things I'm still sorting through, if I'm honest. The relationship with my daughter-in-law is cold in the way that an engine gets cold when you've let it sit too long in January. Technically functional, but not something you'd want to rely on in an emergency. She and I have spoken twice since February, both brief and careful. I don't know what that becomes. Maybe nothing, maybe something. I've stopped arranging it. What I do know is that my son calls me on Sunday evenings now, not to ask for anything, just to talk. We talk about his week, about mine, about the bird feeder, which he finds genuinely funny for reasons I've never fully understood. We talk about Newfoundland. He's looked into taking a week off in August. He hasn't offered to pay for anything, and I haven't asked him to. We're starting small. I repainted the front door again last spring, a deep teal this time. Not because anyone said the old color was tired, but because I walked by a house on Larch Street and thought, I like that. And then I went to the paint store and I got it. I leave for St. John's in 11 days. I booked the ferry last week, and I booked a room in a B&B in Quidi Vidi that has a view of the water, and I made the reservation myself, and I paid for it with money I earned and saved, and did not give to anyone else. The chickadees are still coming to the feeder. The RRSP statement came in the mail last week, and the number on it was higher than the one before. My kitchen table is the same table it always was. I wake up in the morning, and the house is quiet, and it is mine, and I have enough. And after 4 years of watching that word get smaller and smaller, it feels like the most generous word I know.